Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm James from Exhibit B Partners. This is my colleague Rob. We're delighted to have you join us today. We're wanting to talk about a topic that we're very passionate about, thought leadership and disruption. I was thinking back to the very first thought leadership study that I worked on back in around 2004. It was about the retail industry. It was exploring the rise of broadband internet, online shopping, online auctions, new players like Amazon and PayPal who were all starting to disrupt traditional retailers. And to assess this, we conducted a survey of retailers, asked them how they were responding to these threats, where the industry was headed. My colleagues and I interviewed a number of retailers to ask them for more insights, and then we produced a big PDF report on behalf of IBM. The retail industry would go on to change significantly over the next 2 decades, which I hope we forecast at the time, but the nature of how thought leadership studies are created basically didn't change at all. The core formula of survey, interviews, and a PDF report more or less the same today as it was back then. Rob and I were at the Economist Intelligence Unit at the time, one of the first major B2B publishers to get into thought leadership as an offering. In 2011, we set up Longitude Research to produce high-quality, research-backed thought leadership under our clients' brands. We scaled that business as the industry grew, later sold it to the FT Group, where it was rebranded as FT Longitude. But Rob and I have had the sense for some time now that the traditional thought leadership formula urgently needs to change and evolve. And so last year, we set up a new venture called Exhibit B Partners. We aim to help advise companies on how to up their thought leadership game. And today, Rob and I wanted to share a bit more about that shift that we see underway. So thanks for listening in. Please feel free to share comments or questions in the chat function in the platform as we go. Rob, let's talk about disruption.
Great, thanks very much, James, and welcome everyone to this webinar. So disruption is a pertinent theme for thought leadership because as producers in this genre, we've been writing about disruption for many years, whether that's digital transformation, whether that's sustainability, whether that's AI. It's really been our stock in trade for decades. But now it feels as though the tables are turning, and actually it's thought leadership that's facing risk of disruption rather than some of these business topics that we've been writing about for years. And in many ways, it's disruption that we feel is long overdue. Now, going back to the early days of thought leadership, it was really restricted to a handful of top-tier strategy firms and the big four tax and audit firms. And there were quite high barriers to entry in producing this kind of work. It was difficult to do, it was expensive to do, and you needed a lot of capabilities to do it well. Now, though, that's changed completely, and we see pretty much every B2B company worth its salt is getting involved in thought leadership to some extent. And so it's become ubiquitous as a marketing activity in the B2B space, and that makes it harder than ever for companies to stand out. And then there's this little thing called AI, which is making that problem even harder for many of the companies in this space. So thought leadership's facing disruption, but why does that matter and who really cares? Well, I think the first thing to note is that just because we think that it's at risk of disruption doesn't mean to say that we think it's on its last legs or it's something that is not valuable anymore. In fact, quite the contrary. We really still believe passionately that good thought leadership can be an incredibly valuable marketing tool for all B2B companies. But what's needed is change, and what's needed is for companies to try and keep ahead of this coming wave of disruption. So it's worth reminding ourselves why thought leadership matters and what it can do for an organization. Well, the first thing is that it's about more than marketing, in our opinion. It helps to shape conversations. And the best examples that we've seen over the years get leaders talking. They influence the policy agenda, and they shape conversations in society more generally. So it's a really, really powerful communications vehicle. The second reason it's important is that it helps you be remembered as a B2B business. Let's face it, a lot of B2B companies look and sound the same. They do similar things, they say similar things. They're talking about similar topics to each other, whether that's AI, sustainability, or whatever the topics of the day are. So it's always been hard to stand out and get noticed. And given the volume of content being produced, that is more important than ever. So the importance of you being remembered as a B2B company, having these associations between your brand and the things that you want to be known for are critical, because that's what buyers remember, that's what they draw down in future buying situations. And finally, good thought leadership influences buyers. We know that the buying cycle has become longer, it's become more complex, there are more people involved, sales cycles are longer, that's all well known. but actually the role that thought leadership needs to play in those long and complex sales cycles is changing. It needs to influence the buyer at multiple stages, not just at the top of the funnel. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in this webinar.
One of the biggest changes that we've seen over the past 2 decades has been the sheer volume of content being produced, as you were mentioning, Rob. I know you probably can't easily read the chart on the right of your screen, but this is from some research that we've done in Exhibit B, which shows that a quarter of B2B companies now produce more than 100 pieces of content each year, far more than most audiences can absorb. Back in 2021, a survey from Edelman and LinkedIn showed that 2/3 of B2B decision makers had seen a huge increase in thought leadership content. Today, that figure is much higher. And of course, as you mentioned, Rob, AI is changing the calculus further. The barriers to content production are effectively zero, so it's just too easy to create more and more content. And often the content is not that good, but it's passable, and it's very tempting to opt for good enough rather than investing in creating high quality work. This chart's from our recent research. It shows the expected increase in thought leadership budgets for the year ahead. It's good news in one sense. 88% of respondents said budgets would increase, 1/3 by more than 10%. This is obviously encouraging. It shows that companies believe in thought leadership. But it's also a double-edged sword, because higher investment doesn't necessarily translate into higher quality outputs, and yet the volumes will almost certainly continue to increase. The profession itself is also expanding rapidly, with a growing number of people in the game. Back in the early 2000s, it was extremely unusual to meet anyone who had a full-time role in thought leadership. Today, many of the larger B2B firms that we deal with have significant teams of thought leadership specialists. And this pace of growth has really accelerated since 2021. Research that we've done estimates that some 25,000 people now globally on LinkedIn have some kind of linkage to the thought leadership role based on analysis there. And this could well be higher. We're limited to a defined set of job titles from people who actually have a presence in LinkedIn. There are other signs of maturity in the industry. For example, an industry body, the Global Thought Leadership Institute, which is working hard to introduce and establish standards in thought leadership, something we really encourage and applaud.
So James talked there about one aspect of maturity, the growing numbers of in-house experts, and that's a trend that we've been seeing for a number of years. But there are other signs of maturity too, which again is good news and it's positive. So Exhibit B earlier this year conducted some research into the maturity of thought leadership teams across different areas. So how mature are they at governance, at the quality of the work they produce, and their capabilities, and the outcomes that they achieve from this work. And our research shows that they're all pretty optimistic about where they are. So this chart here shows overall maturity and the distribution of that maturity all the way from low on the left to high on the right. And what you can see is that the majority of companies see themselves as pretty mature. So there's a lot of confidence out there, which is a good thing. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that all of this maturity is relative. We're seeing investment across the board in roles, in teams, in functions, and all of these investments. But that's all relative. And if all of your peers are investing at the same rate, and so are your rivals, then all boats are rising at the same rate. So we've done this research, and we're going to share this separately. We won't go into huge amounts of detail on it now. We've also created an assessment tool that will allow clients and prospects of ours to see where they shape up in terms of their peers and across these different areas. And we'd be very happy to share that with you and run through that assessment tool with you at your convenience. So do get in touch with us if that's of interest. So this, the topic of AI, we can't ignore it completely. It's somewhat outside of our scope today, but it's worth mentioning a couple of points about this. As James mentioned, the situation we have today with AI and thought leadership and content creation is that the cost of production is now almost zero, so it's possible to create passable content for very minimal investment and minimal cost. And of course, that's quite tempting for companies to make use of that and take advantage of that when the costs of production are so low. The concern that we have is that it will just make audiences switch off over time and ultimately devalue the whole category of thought leadership if audiences are finding it harder and harder to find quality and to discern good quality thought leadership from that's been created using AI. There's a company called Graphite which estimated that more than half of all content online is AI generated, which is an astonishing figure. That was back in 2025. And but it doesn't mean to say that half of thought leadership is AI generated, but it does tell us I think the direction of travel here. There's another interesting piece of research from HubSpot, and they found that 71% of marketing leaders said that AI was helping them to create content at significantly lower cost. Great, but unfortunately, 52% of them found that it was also less effective as a result. So we have this issue here: more content being created using AI, but ultimately lower effectiveness, and audiences just switching off. So we now get into some of the problems that are causing disruption, and we've got 4 that we're going to talk about this afternoon or this morning. And the first one is formats. And James mentioned this at the outset, that if you look back over 2 decades, the format for most thought leadership has barely changed. It's a survey, the interviews, and the long form report, usually published in PDF format. Now, we don't have a big problem with PDFs. We still think PDFs have a role to play in the thought leadership formula. But the problem I do think is that they're overused. Now, there are actually 2.5 trillion PDFs on the internet, which is an astonishing figure. And we're adding to them every day as thought leadership producers. And I think the issue with the PDF format and the long form report in general is really a question of inertia. It feels like companies have always done it that way. They've always produced long form reports, and that's what their stakeholders expect. That's what their audiences expect. And so they continue doing the same thing. But there's also, I think, a sense in which the attachment to long form in the PDF is a little bit irrational. We're hearing from marketing directors that people aren't really reading these long form reports. Some people do, of course, but not that many, and probably not enough to justify spending all that time on them. And yet it still remains the dominant model for the delivery of most thought leadership. And I think in some sense, it's about a demonstration of effort. Companies go to a lot of effort investing in research and investing in thinking, and they want to have that aura of authority, that aura of credibility from the content that they produce. And the long form report does that for them. But I think it does have other issues, and I think we need to kind of think about its role within a broader context. Now, the PDF does have advantages. It's shareable, it's portable, it's printable, but it has drawbacks too. It's not responsive on mobile, it's a very linear read, it's difficult for audiences to search or navigate to different portions of content, and it's also very difficult for producers to track user behavior, audience behavior, in terms of what they're actually consuming beyond downloads. And more recently, it's become apparent that PDFs are pretty poor from a GEO perspective as well. Large language models find it difficult to parse this content, and that means it's not showing up in reports and summaries in the way that it should be. So will that finally kill the PDF? I don't think so. We're not saying the PDF is dead. We think its role needs to change and probably become slightly less prominent within the mix.
Thanks, Rob. The second problem that we get into is about research quality. It's not all bad, but quality across the industry is highly variable. There's no signposting for readers to guide them on things that have been really well done versus things that haven't. One issue behind this comes from capabilities. Not all that many studies are actually run by research professionals. And there's a host of methodological issues: small sample sizes, complex surveys, leading questions, low quality responses. Surveys are often subjective. They're susceptible to bias, not least as they self-reported. So you get this circular thinking problem, where there's often a major gap between perception and reality on various issues. Another issue is called the narrative fallacy, a term coined by Nassim Taleb. This is about the tendency to create simplistic cause and effect stories from what are complex and sometimes random facts. And this is very common in thought leadership. But we do our audiences a disservice. They're often experienced. They know the issues of the day are messy and complex. There isn't always a black or white solution. It's actually okay to admit complexities rather than oversimplifying. A third issue is about cherry-picking findings. We all know that thought leadership is produced with a commercial agenda in mind. No one thinks these studies are completely independent or that they're applying a pure scientific method, but there are clear risks involved with cherry-picking to suit your commercial agenda. Most obviously, your audience can almost always see through this, so you lose trust and you lose readers. And finally, IMD professor Phil Rosenzweig talks about the delusion of rigorous research in a book called The Halo Effect. Essentially, many reports show very rigorous methodologies, provide superficial trappings of science, while essentially operating at the level of basic storytelling. I think of this every time I see a regular survey reported, which includes 2 decimal places in the figures and deep statistical analysis. The reality is surveys are almost never that precise. A regular issue is also where correlation is confused with causation. The study authors take an input variable, something like investing in AI, and they infer a particular output, like the wider performance of the business. It's an issue you see everywhere in the industry, where often the relationship may actually be the other way around. It could well be that high-performing businesses happen to also invest in AI. Correlation could be entirely coincidental. It could be associated with something completely different. The chart on the right is one of the many classic examples you can find. I know it's difficult to read on the slide, but it's a chart from Tyler Viglin, who publishes a wonderful list of so-called spurious correlations. This particular chart shows the distance between Neptune and Mercury and petroleum consumption in Azerbaijan. You can see there's a strong correlation between the two, but obviously no one's pretending that one leads to the other. It's also really easy to fall into the trap of confirmation bias. We're looking for ways that AI is boosting performance, so we search for insights that confirm this link, and all too often we ignore or dismiss anything that contradicts that. Our point here is that good thought leadership builds trust by being open and transparent. It's fine to provide evidence that suits your commercial agenda, but it's also good practice to highlight the caveats. A related issue crops up with case studies and examples. These are powerful because they're memorable, they're very relatable. The problem is that they're usually entirely positive. Studies tend to look at successes, but ignore any failures. We're not saying that you should focus on the failures, but it is worth looking at the counterexamples. Companies where success took longer than expected, initial pilots that weren't successful and what lessons they learned from them. These kinds of things are much more useful to our audience, and the audience will trust you more if you're honest about them.
The third problem is what we're terming at the top of the funnel mentality. Now, I think traditional leadership has been primarily about brand and reputation, not just, but primarily, and I think widely at the top of the funnel activity, and somewhat removed from the sales conversation. There's always been a bit of an aversion to anything that feels too salesy. And in a way, thought leadership and sales have always been a bit like oil and water, that they shouldn't really mix with each other. But the problem with this top of the funnel mentality is that the benefits are quite difficult to quantify. They take place over the long term, they require multiple interventions, and the benefits build over time. So it's quite difficult for producers to demonstrate cause and effect, or to unpick what's really driving brand uplift. Is it a piece of thought leadership, or is it something else entirely? So this whole top of the funnel concept, we've kind of labeled here as terra incognita, the sort of unknown territory. The problem with it is no one really knows what's going on in the top of the funnel. No one really knows who's there. No one really knows who's doing what. It could well be a land of treasure of thousands of future buyers, or it may be, nothing at all. And what it assumes wrongly, we feel, is that there's lots of people there who are at the beginning of a buying journey, and who are sort of almost in a staging pen, waiting for a thought leadership campaign to propel them forwards. But that isn't really the case. And so I think we're focusing on something that's very difficult to quantify and very difficult to measure, and difficult to see, how it benefits us. Now, we're not saying that we shouldn't focus on brand and shouldn't focus on reputation or top of the funnel, but we do think that the exclusive focus on that does us a bit of a disservice. And I think the reason for it, there's been a degree of faith where companies have said, well, actually, that's what we do. We see the benefits from it, but they still struggle to prove it. And so our contention here is that, we need to move down the funnel. We need to focus on areas where we've got a better idea of who these prospects are. We've got a better idea of how we can influence the purchasing process. Doesn't mean to say that thought leadership themes need to be overtly salesy, but the role that thought leadership plays should be less about just the top of the funnel, but also become a full funnel activity. And the final problem is a structural one, and it's really about how thought leadership fits into the organization. Now, there's a common criticism that's been leveled at thought leadership over the years, that it's a bit of an ivory tower activity. It's all about ideas, and it's far removed from the realities of the customer. And we've seen examples of that throughout our career, of teams that have been set up, and they kind of act a little bit like think tanks, or they're kind of quasi academic in nature. And their currency is very much about ideas rather than the value that those ideas can bring to the business. Now, that model, I think, is not really sustainable. And it's kind of what we're showing on the left here, where thought leadership is a little bit siloed. It's not really connected with the customer. It's not really connected with sales. It has a relationship with marketing, but it's slightly separate from it. And that is a very, very difficult relationship to sustain. And I think, when you have this ivory tower, slightly siloed view of thought leadership, then that's when ultimately the business looks at this at some point and says, well, actually, what benefit is this giving us as an organization? And it gets scaled back or it gets shut down. So the more positive relationship between thought leadership and these other functions is what you see on the right, a much more integrated model where thought leadership is regularly conversing with marketing, if not part of marketing. It's regularly conversing with sales, and it's also directly interacting with the customer. And that's a way to ensure that the content that's being produced is relevant, it's answering audience problems, and ultimately it's having a genuine commercial impact rather than just being about ideas. So what about the solutions? We've talked about some of the issues that we think are driving the risk of disruption. So how do we get companies to think differently about this and move beyond the risk that thought leadership simply becomes table stakes in their organization? So we're going to talk about a few recommendations and solutions to some of those problems that we've already identified in the rest of this webinar. So the first point is a definitional one. And over the years, we've seen the term thought leadership be defined in many different ways and, quite frankly, misused and used to describe pieces of content that aren't really thought leadership at all. And in reality, there's a bit of a wishful thinking at play here where all content gets labeled as thought leadership when it doesn't really deserve that term. So I think the first point we want to make is that we need to be a bit more discerning. We need to be a bit more careful about when we use this term so that it doesn't get used as a blanket description of content, of B2B content. So there's lots of definitions out there. This is ours. So we think it's distinctive research-based content that influences audiences and has a positive brand or commercial impact. And it's worth breaking that down a little bit. So distinctiveness. So we don't think that the role of thought leadership is to come up with entirely original ideas. But it does have to be distinctive. It's got to be something that creates those memories that I was talking about earlier. And it's got to be something that reflects the brand that produces it so that it cements those memories in the audience's mind. It's got to be research-based. So we talked about some of the caveats earlier on. And certainly there are some risks with using research, but research is still a prerequisite of good thought leadership. And then it's got to influence audiences. So we would draw a distinction between content that's there to inform audiences and content that's there to influence them. So the news informs us, but good thought leadership does something different. It plays a different role. It's there to change behavior. It's there to change thinking or challenge perspectives. And so it has to do that, otherwise it's just information. And finally, it's got to have a positive brand or commercial impact. So, why are we doing it otherwise? Most businesses are profit making and they produce thought leadership for a commercial reason. But we need to be able to demonstrate that and we need to be able to measure it.
The next step is about recognizing that you need to go beyond the PDF, even if it's still in the mix as part of the package of content that you create. And as you talked about earlier, Rob, one of the key reasons around this is around AI search. Getting your brand shown as a response to key buyer queries is a really important thought leadership goal. And if PDFs aren't going to be indexed, then you need other content forms to help do that job. This might be spin-off content such as FAQ documents, or even investing time in platforms like Reddit. The goal is to get your content indexed and cited as much as possible. A second important aspect is about providing more sales-relevant diagnostics. What are your audience reading about? What content they're looking for? Where do they put their attention? Are there new issues that are coming into demand or not? PDFs don't give you any guidance on these points. Third, it's about varied content for varied needs and varying attention spans. PDF is very much a one-size-fits-all, but you need a skim, paddle, dive option, the quick snapshot, the bigger summary, and the deep dive. Yes, there are people who want to actually get the deep dive, just not everyone. It also helps to vary the formats. We all learn and consume information in different ways. I might prefer to read, you may like videos, others prefer in person, and so on. The second solution is about the fact that we really need to up our game on the research front. Audiences see through weak methodologies, self-serving findings, and it erodes trust with our readers. Now, we're not saying that your studies need to start having randomized controlled trials, but your readers do expect rigor from their research. If your methodology has shortcomings, be upfront about that. Maybe the sample's very small, maybe it's too selective, maybe it's biased by your existing clients. It's all worth highlighting these things. It doesn't weaken your findings, but it does in turn reinforce trust with your readers. Importantly, we really believe that you need to get more creative with your research methods. A brilliant example that we loved recently was called the Gindex. A guy called Matt Cortland used AI to call 3,000 Irish pubs for St. Patrick's Day to ask the price of a pint, and created an index around this, which got a huge amount of media attention. He's just gone a step further. In the US, he's now used AI to call over 170,000 petrol stations across the country to establish a gas price index, which you can see on the right of the screen. Importantly, this didn't take 3, 4, 5 months to do. The initial inputs were compiled over just a weekend with almost no budget. The index shows a host of information, including the cheapest fuel pump near you, how much more it's cost to fill up your tank since the Iran war started, and it's getting a ton of attention in the US, which is great to see. And the real point here is about being willing to explore and test new and different research methods, and ideally to create or tap into proprietary data wherever possible, going beyond the traditional closed-ended survey. Of course, we don't expect surveys to simply disappear. They've got a really valuable role to play, but we do expect them to evolve and change. For example, by making use of qualitative interviewing at scale. For the past couple of decades, thought leadership practitioners have almost always tried to combine two methods: quantitative surveys at scale to determine a trend, and some limited qualitative interviewing to assess what's driving that trend. But closed-ended surveying is massively problematic. It's very expensive, takes a very long time, and it's almost always imperfect as a research input. Qualitative interviews are much more helpful. They give you much more depth and nuance, but you can't do it at scale. Until now. AI is enabling this to happen at low cost and in very short timeframes. There's a huge number of new tools emerging here: Inca, Convio, Listen Labs, Outset, many more. A ton of venture capital has been invested in to build out these new options, and we think they can be a game changer. Having actual recordings and videos of interviewees drives high quality. They blend qualitative depth with quantitative breadth, and it swaps a flat and often very boring survey with something that's much richer, more multidimensional. They also allow you to tackle more sensitive topics. Some years back, when we set up the Deloitte Women at Work study, we arranged an all-female research team to conduct the interviews due to the sensitive nature of the topics being discussed. With AI, we're seeing that respondents actually answer more openly and often with more candor. Now, we're not suggesting that you won't do human interviews anymore. These are still very valuable, and it helps to include named interviews in your study for more credibility. But AI-enabled qualitative surveying at scale can transform the economics, the timings, and the depth of your next study.
The next solution is more to do with the point I was talking about earlier about the sort of top of the funnel problem. And traditionally, what we've seen is that the connection between thought leadership and revenue has not been that strong. It's been a little bit difficult to track. Sales cycles are long and complex. There's so many touch points between a piece of thought leadership and an eventual sale that that kind of attribution calculation has always been very difficult. So the quote on the right here illustrates the change there, where I think there is this big shift towards thought leadership as a revenue driver. So this is from Anya Bryn. She's Chief Marketing Officer of Marsh in the UK. And she says that thought leadership has to do everything it used to do in terms of building brand, but also it needs to deliver commercial value. There has to be a financial return. So that's a big shift in terms of the KPIs that often have been key to most thought leadership. So traditionally, because it was the top of the funnel activity, it was about MQLs, but MQLs are a bit of a controversial KPI at the moment. Lots of people are discrediting them. But I think in the thought leadership context, they have value, but we also need to see thought leadership delivering value further down the conversation, and looking at touch points and looking at how it influences the pipeline, how it influences the win rate and the renewal rate as well. The next solution is a bit more of a structural one, and it's about empowering marketing and communications teams to make a real difference. So I think that the point we would make is that marketing and communications teams need to be the guardians of the thought leadership strategy. That's not always the case. So, we need to think about their role and think about how they can use what they do in thought leadership to drive commercial gains. The quote on the right here from Will Sturgeon at PwC illustrates part of the problem, and it's the issue of silos. So I talked earlier about this kind of linear relationship between thought leadership and marketing and sales and the customer, and the need to shift to this more integrated approach. And that's kind of what we're saying here, and I think what Will's saying here as well. You shift to where your skill sets are, and so your salespeople are out using thought leadership, and there's closer integration and closer conversation between these teams so that they're all rowing in the same direction rather than focusing on their own KPIs and their own objectives. So that means shifting away from a kind of ivory tower think tank style approach towards thought leadership that genuinely focuses on real world problems. It means moving away from this idea of white space. So I talked earlier about distinctiveness being important in the definition. White space is a phrase that's used a lot in thought leadership as being something that we should be aiming for, this idea of completely original ideas. We don't really believe that that's that important, actually. What's more important is that we're creating content that's relevant to our audience, that's answering their questions, and that's actually genuinely audience-centric. And finally, we just need to be full funnel. We need to see the role of thought leadership, delivering benefits throughout very long and complex sales cycles. And this next piece is again a slightly structural one to do with pet projects and the way we generate ideas in companies. So I think very often marketing teams have absolutely the best intentions, but the problem is that the way that the ideas are generated within the organization makes it difficult to control and create or develop a coherent narrative. So the quote on the right here from Joel Harrison talks about this quite well. The idea that thought leadership is often ego-driven, and it's all about ideas that come from leaders, and marketing ultimately ends up scrambling around trying to pull these together, figure out a way to create points of view out of them. And the problem is, again, is you get this slightly sort of jumbled, set of content pieces that don't really link to a wider strategic agenda or narrative. And so this is about wresting control and taking control of that narrative, taking control over the messaging as opposed to it being delivered by and driven by leadership fiefdoms. And we're not saying that we shouldn't listen to leaders, of course, but it's about creating a framework and parameters where the ideas that they have align with that strategic narrative, and that they aren't pet projects, but they're actually business-aligned projects. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a sensitive topic to raise. But when that's done well, and when these ideas link to a strategic editorial agenda, then we see much better benefits. And the distinction that we always draw here is between an inside-out approach and an outside-in approach. Inside-out means that as an organization, we have something to say, and we broadcast it to the audience, and we think the audience wants to hear this. Outside-in is the other way around. We start with the audience need, and we work back from there. And I think if we take that principle on board, then we harness the views of our leaders and the opinions that they have, but we do so within a framework that actually makes sense as an organization and that has a coherent narrative. And the final point is to do with operating models. Again, a bit of a structural one. And there's no single right answer to this, I don't think. And over our years in thought leadership, we've seen multiple different variations of this. But broadly speaking, they break down into three. So a lot of companies have quite a centralized thought leadership model. So everything's controlled from the center, and that creates consistency. That prevents the mix that you've got all these kind of random acts of content that are kind of creating a slightly cacophonous narrative. But it does have problems in the sense that it's too rigid, it's too bureaucratic, and ultimately it's a bit inflexible and can be a bottleneck, quite frankly. On the other end of the spectrum, you see some models that are more decentralized in nature, where you've got marketing and thought leadership teams sitting much closer to the customer and sitting much closer to the issues that the audiences care about. So from that point of view, it's great because it creates really, really relevant content. The problem here is that it can be inefficient, and that you see risks where there are different narratives coming out from different parts of the organization that either overlap, duplicate each other, or sometimes even conflict with each other. So what we think is the better approach is to see this as more of a hybrid, more of a global approach, if you like, we believe in centralization to an extent. We think there are certain things that should be centralized because it makes sense to do so. So having a clear editorial strategy, having clear guidelines and editorial guidelines and tone of voice and an editorial calendar is all absolutely key and makes sense to be centralized. But you need that degree of flexibility. You need to be close to local markets to ensure that content remains relevant, because I think the problem has been over many years that there's too much thought leadership that doesn't really pay enough attention to what audiences want or what the customer wants. And it's a bit abstract in nature, and so it doesn't hit the mark.
Thank you, Rob. Wanted to reiterate that in the coming weeks, we'll be publishing a lot more insights from our research, and we will, of course, share that with everyone who's joined today. And as mentioned earlier, we also have a new thought leadership maturity tool where you can evaluate your organization against your peers. So please do feel free to be in touch if that's something you'd be interested in looking at. My colleague Jemima is also on the call. She'll be following up, and she'll be very happy to help set up something for discussion around that. But for now, it'd be nice to turn to some of the questions that we've got coming through in this. And we had one that came in before we kicked off, Rob, and this was from Andrew about how we get everyone across the organization onto the same page with regards to thought leadership. You've been talking a little bit about that, Rob, in your last few slides, but maybe there's some other points to add. And I see that Cindy Anderson from IBM commented earlier about the Global Thought Leadership Initiative certificate as a separate way to help about improving, education and getting people sort of on the same page. But any other thoughts on that front?
Yeah, I think part of it is having a consistent view across the organisation about what we're trying to achieve with thought leadership, and that's not just one thing. Often there are multiple objectives, and there should be multiple objectives. But I think the first thing is having clarity about that, because what we see sometimes is that there is either different definitions being used or different views about what it's for, or how it should be used, and that just creates a difficulty and a set of problems in terms of creating coherence. So first of all, it's simple things like workshops and events that bring people together and understand different perspectives and try to harness it in a way that achieves these different objectives in a clear and consistent way. So I think partly it's about conversations, and that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is being clear that it should be a portfolio. There are different types of thought leadership that should do different things. So absolutely, still top of the funnel is key. It's one of the objectives. It should be there to build brand. It should be there to deliver reputational benefits. But also, it should be doing things further down the funnel as well. So in other words, we're serving different teams' needs and serving different commercial and business needs, and doing that in a way that doesn't prioritize one over the other, but does so in a way that we're kind of sharing our resources in a way that makes sense to achieve those different objectives, because it is a multi-stakeholder activity, and it can serve the business in different ways.
Thanks, Rob. There's a question from David, and I'll probably touch on this one, asking around the kinds of AI tools used for conducting this kind of research for thought leadership, and the question about being off-the-shelf offerings, ChatGPT Pro and so on, versus other more specialized tools. And David, I think it depends a bit on the skills and resources of the organization in question. When we interviewed Matt Cortland behind the Gindex and the gas price index, he's an AI engineer, so he's very comfortable with using these tools directly. And I believe he used Anthropic in his last piece to conduct the interviews at scale. And I know that Anthropic actually is another example. They've conducted a survey of their own, a qualitative survey of their own, with tens of thousands of respondents, all done through an AI agent like that. But for those that don't necessarily have that comfort, or that don't have the internal skill sets in-house, as I mentioned earlier, there are a range of dedicated tools coming into the market. And I think some of these make the life of the team leading a project like this much, much easier. We've been testing a number of these. I conducted a survey recently of finance leaders, and it was pretty mind-blowing, actually, how effective and quickly you're able to kind of get to an outcome, deploy a survey, and actually see the responses kind of firsthand and analyze the inputs that they're giving, much, much richer than the traditional closed-ended survey. So I think for organizations that don't have the resources and expertise, or they aren't so comfortable about that, they'll probably have more luck using dedicated tools like those as opposed to open platforms. A different question, Rob. Some of our clients are looking at thought leadership from the perspective of turning their execs into thought leaders, possibly spurred by LinkedIn. Do you see potential disruptions arriving from influencer-driven thought leadership on LinkedIn? I think it's worth commenting on sort of the rise of influencers in general.
Yeah, I think there's always sort of the individual thought leader and the brand thought leader, I guess. And I think the best way to work with that is to try and find ways to combine them, because ultimately, individual leaders on the likes of LinkedIn typically have much bigger followings than company pages. So I think relying on company pages and group pages and things like that is certainly limiting in that sense. And so we ought to do what we can to harness the followings of individual leaders. I think, again, a little bit like the comment I was making earlier, it's about finding ways to do that in such a way that allows them to express their personality and allows them to do that in a way that doesn't limit them or make them feel constrained, but at the same time does so within the parameters of the overall narrative that you're trying to produce as an organization. So I think partly that's getting their buy-in and getting their investment early and encouraging them to be part of thought leadership programs from the outset, and making it easy for them, essentially. I think the easier we make it for individuals on thought leadership, the executives that we want to promote the brand or the campaign, making it easy as possible for them to do that, I think is certainly in our best interests. I mean, do we see potential disruptions from this? I think the two things can coexist. I think they exist side by side, and there's no doubt that there is a rise of B2B influencers. But I think that's a complement to traditional thought leadership rather than an alternative.
Thanks, Rob. The Q&A, we got a question. With the recommendation to use thought leadership as a revenue driver, does this mean that content should be gated? From Christina, thank you. I think it's an interesting point and depends a little bit on the marketing objectives of the campaign you're running. And in some instances, you may find that that's a valuable thing to do. But perhaps more often, I suggest that you're wanting audiences to find and discover your content. You're wanting to have as few kind of barriers to entry for them to discover this and to engage with it. And there's perhaps other more effective ways to capture leads and to generate sort of contacts. And importantly, we talked about this AI search point, but if you're putting your content behind a barrier, it's more difficult to get indexed. It's less likely to be picked up and cited. And I think that's quite a major concern on this. So probably our recommendation on this would be to keep your content, your insights sort of available for people to access and available to be indexed. But find sort of related things, webinars like this, where people can sign up to hear firsthand about your results and findings, or related events that you might be hosting, or indeed sort of interactive tools that you might create that can engage people and help them understand how they're doing relative to their peers on something. I think there's a range of other mechanisms that you can consider before kind of getting into gating on this. A separate question on this, AI adoption is often in pilot or trial phase of many companies, often very basic. What's your experience in breaking through such barriers at companies, especially large organizations, to facilitate AI adoption? It's quite a big question, this. And in fact, the first thing I'd say is I'd recommend we do have a recorded version of our prior webinar, which was about sort of the use of AI in thought leadership, and covered a lot of ground on that front, and it's worth revisiting some of that points. It's free and open to access. I think a lot of this comes down to the organizational DNA. It was interesting, just today was reading an article about Amazon in the Financial Times and the extreme pressure that teams are under within the organization to adopt and use AI. To the point that people are now actually trying to sort of game it and trying to sort of use AI for largely irrelevant tasks, purely in order to show that they're actually using this and the number of tokens that they're using, which gets tracked at an organizational level. We're really not getting into sort of recommending that sort of approach, but My point being that some organizations will be pushing you very, very hard to do this. Others will be focused on the basics, helping ensure that tools are available, helping ensure that training is available, helping to set standards across the organization, helping to share case studies and best practices of other use cases and things that are working well. And those are the kinds of things that I think probably do a lot to help and to facilitate adoption on that front. A question about formats, Rob. Apart from the PDF, what formats have we seen do well lately? LinkedIn Pulse, CEO videos, podcasts. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's with thought leadership campaigns, it's all about sort of and rather than or. I think the budget allowing, the more variety we can offer our audiences, the better, quite frankly, because as you said earlier, first of all, people have different preferences in terms of the content that they prefer to use, but also they have different needs at different times. So sometimes they want short form, sometimes they want long form, and so we need to cater for those needs as well. We're definitely seeing video doing really well. We're definitely seeing a lot of investment in video at the moment. So I think that's a growing format. I think podcasts is definitely a good one, but it feels to me like it's quite difficult to build an audience with them now. It feels quite a sort of saturated market, and so difficult to break into if you haven't already done so. But I think also the thing that I see working really well is a combination between online and offline. I think combination of events with thought leadership is really, really good because it gives you the foundation, but also the platform for the conversation, and it can work really well from a lead gen standpoint. And the other thing I think, just in formats, the thing that we briefly touched on it, but one of the key points we're making here is about thought leadership being more commercial in nature. Then I think creating formats that are more suitable for distribution by a sales team or for a commercial team to have conversations around is really key. So interactives and diagnostics, I think, is a good example where we can take versions of research and sort of share that with individuals and sort of see how they compare, a little bit like the assessment tool that we were talking about earlier. I think that's a really good interactive format that can be a good basis for a conversation. So I think it's thinking about the channels first, and then what are the best formats for distributing across those channels.
Yeah, and Rob, I see there's been a helpful comment from, unfortunately can't see the name of the person, so thank you to whoever put this comment in about saying you use shorthand for long form content, which provides useful analytics and is more interactive for the readers with better SEO and GEO. That's really nice to hear. And thank you, Sandra, as well. Your point around sort of creating interactive tools and diagnostics works really well to get sales and clients engaged. They aren't easy to create. We know this quite well, and in fact, we work very closely with an organization, Grounded, that helps organizations to do this kind of thing. So I'd probably cite them as an example of an organization that can help do this well, and we can share sort of separate examples for things like Autodesk and that. But the principle here is that interactive tools can be really, really helpful, and they can get that sales conversation going, which is great, and helps the thought leadership kind of lead get more attention and more kind of input from other parts of the business on this. There was an earlier point raised about message rigidity, painfully familiar topic. Do you have tips and tricks to convince decision makers to loosen up a bit? Robert, and I don't know if you've got points on this. I think this varies so much from individual and organization. There's a lot in the organizational DNA as well about sort of how willing an organization is to have a point of view. We've, certainly in certain sectors like the law sector, we've historically seen organizations that are very, very reluctant to actually come out and say something even remotely sort of interesting or provocative. They really want to kind of be buttoned down in their perspective, which can be counterproductive. It's harder to kind of get attention around that. Others, of course, things like, sort of training and education can really, really help and encourage people to go further, to engage with that. Obviously bringing in sort of external professionals to help support that and to provide, whether it's training or whether just to help steer individuals through that kind of process, can also help a lot on that front. And show them how a different perspective can really move the needle for them, can help them get more attention, can help open the door to new client conversations, and help them get more comfortable with that. Don't know if you'd add anything else to that, Rob.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that we talked earlier about the kind of volume of content that's being produced and that's coming out being a key issue. So I think it's sort of explaining to these decision makers that message rigidity leads to messages not landing, and I think probably the more that you can involve the audience in this and customers and get their feedback. I think if they feel the messages are rigid and not very interesting, then they need to feed that back. And if they feed that back, it might prompt a bit of a change of approach, whereby people loosen up a bit, as you say, and try and be a bit more provocative, because hopefully they recognise ultimately that they need to do that in order to get noticed, because otherwise you just get lost in the noise.
Yeah. And a final comment to say that podcasts and LinkedIn also shared here. Yes, definitely. It goes back to our point earlier about you really want to provide content in a range of formats and channels for people who engage in different ways and prefer content in different formats, and do as much of that as you can and are able to. So thank you, Rob. I think we're out of time on this. A big thank you to everyone on the call today. We really appreciate your time and attention. Thank you for your great comments and questions. We're still developing the ideas that we shared today. We very much welcome additional input and feedback that you might have on where and how thought leadership should be transformed in the years ahead. And I very much hope in the time ahead that we'll be seeing stronger and better studies capturing the attention of your audiences. But for now, thank you very much. I wish you an excellent week ahead. Goodbye, and hope to stay in touch.
Thank you. Goodbye.